Hi, and welcome to the Origins Podcast. I'm your host, Lawrence Krauss. As many of you know, my new book, The War on Science, is appearing July 29th of this year in the United States and Canada. And to celebrate that, we've interviewed many of the authors, of the 39 authors who have contributed to this volume. And we have 20 separate podcast interviews that will be airing over the next 20 days, starting July 22nd, before and after the book first appears, with many of the authors in the book on a host of different subjects. The authors we will have interviews with in order of appearance over the next 20 days are Richard Dawkins, Neil Ferguson, Nicholas Christakis, Martin Boudry, Abigail Thompson, John Armstrong, Sally Satel, Solveig Gold, and Joshua Katz, Francis Widdowson, Carol Hooven, Janice Fiamengo, Jeff Horseman, Alessandro Strumia, Roger Cohen and Amy Wax, Peter Boghossian, Lauren Schwartz and Arthur Rousseau, Alex Byrne and Modi Gorin, Judith Sisa and Alice Sullivan, Carlene Gribble, and finally Dorian Abbott. The topics that will be discussed will range over the need for free speech and open inquiry in science and the need to preserve scientific integrity, stressed by our first podcast interviewee, Richard Dawkins, and we'll once again go over historical examples of how academia has been hijacked by ideology in the past and the negative consequences that have come from that, to issues of how specific disciplines, including mathematics, have been distorted, and how certain departments at universities now specifically claim that they are social activists, and a degree in their field is a degree in either critical social justice or social activism, not a degree in a specific area of scholarship, how ideology has permeated universities. We'll proceed also to discuss issues in medicine. Sally Satel will talk about how social justice has hijacked medicine. And also, when it comes to issues of gender-affirming care, we have a variety of authors who are going to speak about the issues there and how too often gender-affirming care claims are made that are not based on empirical evidence, in fact, falsely discuss the literature in ways that are harmful to young people. We'll talk to several people who, for one reason or another, have been canceled for saying things. Francis Widdowson at Mount Royal University in Canada, and Carol Hooven from Harvard, who eventually had to leave Harvard after saying on television that sex is binary in biology. We'll be talking to people who've looking at the impact of diversity, equity, and inclusion in academia and how it's restricting free inquiry and also restricting, in many ways, scientific merit at those universities. And finally, Dorian Abbott, the last contributor to our series, will be talking about 3 principles he believes are essential to separate science and politics and keep academia free from ideology and more for open questioning and progress, and to make sure that science is based on empirical evidence, and where we go where the evidence is, whether it's convenient or not, whether it's politically correct or not, and we're willing to debate all ideas, that nothing is sacred, a central feature of what science should be about and what, in some sense, this podcast is about. So I hope you really enjoy the next 20 days, and we've enjoyed bringing it to you. So with no further ado, The War on Science, the interviews.
Well, Richard Dawkins, it's always great to see you. It's always great to be with you. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
You look very divine in your up there in the sky, and which is appropriate. And
I just discovered this stupid background and I can't switch it off now.
Oh no, it's great. I love it. It really it's appropriate in my opinion. And I'm so happy not only that you're here to discuss your chapter in your book, but that you wrote the chapter in the book. It's the first chapter in the book, and it captures so much of what the book is about, and it's as I would have expected, and is the case. It's beautifully written, lyrical, and I want to go through it with you. And the title also, I think, is incredibly important. The title of the piece is "Scientific Truths Stand Above Human Feelings and Politics," which I think is the key point. And it sets the tone of really the book is about the incursion of ideology into science and and academia and society more generally, but particularly science. And it talks about, in this case, two specific examples of ideology impacting on science, one historical and one more modern. But you started out before we get there talking about in the nature of science, and again in a lovely lyrical way. You point out that science isn't just we say science is universal, but we often, when we think of that, we mean it doesn't depend upon where you are or who you are. But as you point out, it doesn't even matter what planet you live on.
Yes.
And it's universal in a true sense, not a terrestrial sense. And you say, your first sentence is, if intelligent extraterrestrial beings ever visit us, what common ground shall we find for conversation? And of course, you say science. And I think that is particularly important, as opposed to the more ideological ideas such as systemic racism, decolonizing the curriculum, cultural appropriation. Those are not scientific terms, and I think that's a key differentiation. And when you talk about science, of course, one can extol the scientific method, but and you do, but you give a great example of the scientific method that really takes it away from sort of human biases and in an important way, and that's the double-blind control trial. So why don't you talk about that a little bit?
Okay. The double-blind control trial is big in medicine. I'm not sure who invented it. It's pretty obvious, really. You have to try to get rid of your own biases. Any scientist with the best will in the world will want a certain result to come out of the experiment, perhaps. And in a medical experiment where you're testing, say, a new drug against a control, the placebo effect is so important that if the patient or the doctor or the nurse or anyone has the slightest inkling as to which pill is the experimental and which is the control, it can bias the results. And even if it doesn't, when you publish the results, the readers can only know for sure that they can trust it if it's been double-blinded. It's not always possible. I mean, in the case of surgical procedures, nobody's going to volunteer on the off chance of being the control in a surgical procedure. So you can't always do it. But in the cases where you can do it, it is the gold standard for objective scientific truth, which is guaranteed to be not biased by subjective feelings.
Yeah, as you beautifully write, it stands for the exclusion of feelings, subjective impressions, lived experience, and the pernicious notion that, quote, your truth is different from my truth and everyone's truth is equally valid. The only fully reliable truth is the truth supported by objective, publicly inescapable evidence. And the double-blind experiment is a beautiful example of that. And you go further to point out, the different kinds of truth, which is becoming so prevalent nowadays in popular parlance, lived experience truth or indigenous truth. But as you say, there's two quotes of yours that I particularly like here. Where facts are concerned, there's only one way to determine their truth or falsehood, and that's to examine the evidence. The best way to know how to evaluate the evidence is the scientific method. And most importantly, when you think of sort of cultural or socially derived truth, you say the facts of science were facts long before there were humans to discover them.
Yes.
And they'll be facts long after our species is gone. I think that's a really important factor. They don't require our interpretation for stars to exist.
Yes, a kind of arrogance to assume that humans have to be involved in everything. I met this in New Zealand recently, where there's a move to import Maori, quote, ways of knowing into science curricula. As you were saying earlier, science is universal. If there are Maori ways of knowing which are valuable, then they should be all over the world, not just in New Zealand. That's
Exactly. I don't know if he's a friend of yours, but you certainly know Tim Minchin probably. But I love the fact when he says this, he talks about, there's a great line in one of his pieces where he says, you know what they call alternative medicine that works? Medicine.
Yes, quite. Yes.
And I had that, actually, I was at an event that was sponsored. It might have been, I don't know if it was related to Richard Dawkins, but it was in China a long time ago. No, it was for CFI long ago. And there was a big meeting, and they kept talking about Chinese medicine. Another name I kind of hate, because they have the same DNA, the same ATP. If it's not Chinese medicine, it's not Western medicine. It's medicine if it works.
Yes.
Yeah. And I think that's the important thing about science. Now, in this case, of course, the first example you give of this vain hubris, which of humans assuming somehow that they're that in the face of eternal and universal verities of science, somehow our human politics are more important. The first example you give is a tragic one, which is Lysenko, and we talk about that in detail. I learned a lot actually from reading your piece about Lysenko, and he, as is well known, he basically was responsible for the starvation of literally millions of people in Russia and later on in China. And why don't you talk a little bit about him?
He was a charlatan. He knew very little science. He had fixed ideas, and he caught the ear of Stalin, and that was the whole point. Stalin loved it because it chimed in with his Marxist prejudices. And so Lysenko became in charge of Soviet agriculture eventually. He had huge power, and he abused his power. He even had his rivals imprisoned or even executed. And as you say, he was the cause of mass starvation, not just in Russia, but in China as well. The main source of the quotations that I give is a book that Lysenko edited, 1949, I think, about a 1948 conference in Moscow, where one after another the delegates stood up and denounced what they called Mendelist, Morganist, Weissmanist heresy. It's just like a religious meeting, and all the speeches ended with rousing cheers for Comrade Stalin. It's a chilling, horrible document. It's got a very innocuous title, The Situation in Biological Science.
Exactly.
But it's a really sinister document.
Yeah, it sounds innocuous. The Situation in Biological Science sounds like a science document. And I want to parse some of this more carefully. The summary you've given is beautiful. I want to parse it because to understand exactly what he got wrong and how it related to Marxism. And you just mentioned this Mendelism, Morganism, Weissmanism, as opposed to Maturinism, which is what Lysenko promoted, and it was very Lamarckian. So why don't you briefly describe what this Maturinism is?
Well, Maturin was just a horticulturalist. He was a gardener, really, and he believed in Lamarckian inheritance of acquired characteristics, or he probably did. Anyway, Lysenko assumed that he did, and grafted the doctrine onto his name, and so he became a kind of hero in Soviet agronomy at the time. He was dead by then, and everybody had to bow the knee to his so-called doctrines. He was just a gardener, really. And he and Lysenko both believed in inheritance of acquired characteristics, which is anti-genetic. It's not true. It's a doctrine which persistently rears its head. Lots of people want it to be true. They have a sort of human, probably political desire for it to be true. If it were true, then they believe it could be used to sort of in the perfection of humanity, that kind of thing. The Weissman alternative, which is that you get the genes you're doled and nothing you can do about it, they're yours, and then you pass on half of them to each of your children, and you don't influence them on the way through. They just flow through you like a river. That's very different. That was anathema to Lysenko and to Stalin and to essentially all of Soviet agronomy at the time, except for the heretics who were imprisoned, banished, or executed.
And that idea, and you say that basically he rediscovered a very Lamarckian notion, and it's a simple notion. Anyone who I suppose who gardens knows that plants can change and respond to environmental stress. Cold can induce them to flower, etc. And that's called vernalization. But you say where it went wrong, and very big
it's
wrong.
Not inherited. I mean, it's
exactly.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It was the belief that it was inherited, that some kind of memory could go on.
Yes,
and that's
quite.
very Lamarckian. And and I think the point you make here, and people may wonder why did it catch on? And you say his nonsense would have died a natural death had it not conformed to Soviet ideology and the quasi-religious Marxist faith in the indefinite improvability and malleability of man, which goes with his general suspicion of genetics. So the idea that people can, that in future generations can improve because of what of genetically, literally, because of what past generations have done. And
Yes.
I mean, well, at least what past generations have said. Of course, they can improve by what past generations have done. I mean, in the sense that if past generations, if you're in a society, for example, that where people don't believe the rustling of the trees or lions, your future generations will suffer for that. But the idea that the genes are changed by what you're doing in your life is
Yes.
certainly. But it captured onto that. That's where I hadn't heard that before. I was always wondering why Lysenko caught on, and it's that notion, that the Marxist notion that man can improve and be malleable. And I think that's
so. Yes, and there were Western scientists like Bernal and even J.B.S. Haldane, who were, because of their Marxist belief, they briefly, in Haldane's case, not so briefly in Bernal's case, latched onto it and championed him, and in some cases tried to do experiments to verify what he said was true.
And it's funny because Haldane you think of as a great biologist, but they eventually let go of that, or no?
Well, I think he was a Marxist to the end, but he would have given up on Lysenko, certainly, yes.
And then you do point out that I hadn't realized. I knew that it caused great starvation in Russia, but actually later on, between 1959 and 61, you say as many as 45 million Chinese people died as a result of starvation, because that Lysenko's crackpot ideas had caught on with Mao's Great Leap Forward. I didn't know that.
For the same ideological reason.
Yeah, that's amazing. Now, there are quotes from this conference that I think I have to read because they really capture how political ideology supersedes science here. Thus, comrades, as regards the theoretical line of biology, Soviet biologists hold that the Maturin principles are the only scientific principles. The Weismanists and their followers who deny the heritability of acquired characters are not worth dwelling on at too great length. The future belongs to Maturin, and that V.I. Lenin and J.V. Stalin discovered I.V. Maturin and made his teachings a possession of the Soviet people. And it goes on, what is interesting, and again, I think it's important to view in the modern context of how this has happened in different modern attacks on science by ideology, is to see how other academics pile on, and you quote another speeches by other people other than Lysenko, saying the only correct theory, the one capable of illuminating the path of practical agronomy, is the Maturin-Lysenko theory. I cannot refrain from telling you a curious incident that when a professor protested, and how awful that was, and where people are beginning to condemn those who think otherwise. And I think that's a really important characteristic of this.
Yes, and at the end of the conference, there are these pathetic individuals who stood up and confessed their sins. That's well worth having a look at.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, that is, and again, you see that kind of. I tend to think of Maoist confession, but but before we get there, but there was the attack on Vavilov on the grounds that it centers on the origins of plants and Drosophila and things like that. Was Vavilov the person who Lysenko had eventually punished? Is he the person?
Yes.
Yes.
Vavilov was a genuinely distinguished plant geneticist. He was hugely distinguished. He made enormous collections of plant seeds, and he was a very distinguished scientist. He was eventually arrested on trumped-up charges of espionage, and he died in prison under horrible circumstances. He's been rehabilitated in Russia since that time.
Well, that's good to know, of course. But But now let's get to these retractions, which are interesting because I see so similarities between what I see here and what's happening now in a variety of scientists. One person wrote, "When I leave this session, the first thing I must do is to review not only my own attitude towards the new Maturian science, but my entire early activity. And then let the past, which divided me from T.D. Lysenko, although not always, it's true, be forgotten. Believe me that I take this step today as a party member and as a sincere member of our party. That is honestly." And that kind of retraction is interesting to see because there are many papers now in a variety of areas, not just gender, which we'll talk about, where people retract their papers after the fact from journals because they might cause offense, for example, and or people in to take a biological example, and someone you and I both know, Francis Collins, who was head of the National Institutes of Health after the George Floyd's incident, when it became de rigueur to say that science was systemically racist. He confessed that the National Institutes of Health had been systemically racist basically all the time he was director. But that kind of virtue signaling obviously means nothing, because if he really believed that, he would have resigned. But you see that there. In any case, and in Lysenko's case, people's lives were really at risk, as you point out with Vavilov, and it's that disturbing aspect of people lives being at risk, and nowadays the modern version of that is not so much people's lives, but people's careers being at risk, people's professional careers and their reputations. And then you turn to a more modern example and a very current example of ideology intruding on science, which is in your section, is sex a social construct. And there's a kind of interesting things here that I as always, I learned from reading you. You quote Alan Sokal, who has a piece in the book. For this is based on this postmodernist attitude to science, and he defines it as so-called scientific knowledge does not, in fact, constitute objective knowledge of a reality external to ourselves, but is a mere social construction on par with myths and religions, which therefore have an equal claim to validity. And these two quotes from social scientists that you have here blew me away, and I have to read them. One, geologist Harry Collins: "The natural world has a small or non-existent role in the construction of scientific knowledge." I mean,
yes.
I mean, how can he even say that? It's just shocking.
Yes.
And then this other person, another social scientist, Kenneth Gergen: "The validity of theoretical propositions in the sciences is in no way affected by factual evidence."
Yes.
I mean, people could make this up, but you point out what a social construct is. Two examples that I think are great. One is money, and one is the calendar. Why don't you just elaborate on that?
Yeah. Well, money has no intrinsic value. It only has value because other people value it, and so that is a social construct. And as I point out, a bit of green paper with $1 written on it, and a bit of green paper with $100 on it. The second one is 100 times more value than the first, but they're just bits of green paper. It is a social construct that makes the difference. The calendar, well, the length of a year in terms of days is an objective fact that's governed by the rotation of the Earth and the orbit of the Earth around the Sun. But the calendar, the division into 12 months, the division into weeks of 7 days, that's a social construct. And I quote the rather humorous example of the lost 11 days when the Julian calendar was superseded by the Gregorian calendar, and they jumped 11 days sometime in September. And people allegedly rioted because they thought 11 days had been stolen from their lives. I mean, that's the elevation of a social construct where it has no business.
Exactly. Yeah, the calendar is social construct. The Earth's orbit isn't, and no matter what you think, the Earth orbit takes a certain amount of time, and I think it's a great example for people who may want to see that. Then it's the other aspect of postmodernism is this notion of power, and you quote another quotation from Sokal is from Stanley Arnowitz, who says, "Science legitimizes itself by linking its discoveries with power, a connection which determines and not merely influences what constitutes as reliable knowledge." The notion that somehow everything can be defined in terms of power, and knowledge is only defined by people who have power rather than something external to people. And you say this attitude exemplifies the hubristic aggrandizement of human power, arrogating to mere humans a quasi-divine dominion over nature itself. And as with Lysenko's determination to overrule science, if science conflicted with Marxist-Leninist theories, if reality is a mere social construct, society has the power to change reality. And now you come in, you would say that you would argue that legally declaring a man to be a woman just because he wants to be a woman has much in common with the perpetual motion joke and the calendar rides joke. But of course,
Yeah, the perpetual motion joke I should mention was
one
repeal the laws of thermodynamics so we can have perpetual motion. Yes.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes,
That's right. It's a great idea, and I get letters all the time from people who think they have.
yes.
But unfortunately, that's the curse of being a physicist. But the depth of the main point is that there is a well-defined definition of sex, which we'll get to, but the intrusion of it is real. And you point out that the American Medical Association in 2023, and I should say we have a number of articles in the book by doctors talking about this intrusion in gender affirming care, as well as the definition of sex. But that the AMA in 2023 laid down some best practices for sex and gender diversity. Medical students would be taught that both sex and gender are socially constructed, and quote, it is appropriate to affirm each individual's self-determination regarding both sex and gender labels. And this is and you ask the question, are we seriously training a generation of young doctors to think that the sex of a patient is a matter of individual choice, not merely an anatomical and physiological reality? And what's crazy about this is if you ask almost all patients, they would know the answer to that right away. And it's scary to think that their doctors don't.
Well, I think doctors do, but the American Medical Association is trying to kowtow to fashionable doctrine. But in practice, I mean, any doctor who treats a biological male as though he was female when actually treating him as a patient is not a very good doctor.
Yeah, that's what one would expect. And you make another important point, which is really important. You see, you can imagine, and I think there are already present lawsuits, not future ones. I think in the States there are lawsuits like from people who have transitioned were transitioned when they were minors, who feel like that they didn't have that choice. But you can say, I could imagine future lawsuits against surgeons who, in violation of the first clause of the Hippocratic Oath, which is to do no harm, have cut off the breasts of girls below the age of consent for no better reason than a subsequently regretted claim to have been assigned the wrong sex. What, after all, does below the age of consent mean, if not too young to make permanent, life-changing decisions? And that's a huge issue.
The age of consent is a legal demarcation.
Yes.
When a girl in this case is capable of consenting to have sex, and obviously it's an arbitrary demarcation, but nevertheless it's there. And you think that the decision to have your breasts cut off would be at least as radical as a decision to have sex.
Yeah,
exactly. So any surgeon who cuts the breasts off a girl below the age of consent just because she thinks she's a boy deserves to be struck off. And I hope in future they will be.
Well, I think we're seeing, as a number of people, and I've already had interviews with a number of people, a number of the scientists or doctors who write about this in the book. That's happening. What's unfortunate is at this moment is it's happening much more effectively in the UK and Europe than it is in the United States. The United States is behind the curve.
You mean the opposition to that is
the opposition.
Yes.
Exactly, yeah, is with the Cass report and other reports in the UK and others pointing out that basically gender affirming care, that children should not be, life-changing decisions should not be made on children.
Yes.
And Europe is along with that too, but it hasn't happened yet in the United States. Okay, so yet we then turn to biology, which is great because that's your field, and you point out the definition of sex and why it's a definition of sex is really important, because so often I hear the definition of sex to be XY chromosomes versus XX, and instead you you advocate what you shall call the universal biological definition, which is based on gamete size. And you
Yes.
say that because it's the only definition that applies all the way across animal and plant kingdoms and all the way through evolutionary history. So why don't
Yes.
you describe that?
Yeah. Well, chromosomes work for mammals. I mean, in mammals, males the XY and females the XX. In birds and butterflies, it's the other way around. Birds are the equivalent of the XY. In many reptiles, it's done by temperature. In some reptiles, it's done by the XXXY system. There are all sorts of ways in which sex is determined. So there's nothing universal about that. The gamete size criterion for defining male and female is universal. It's universal in all animals and plants, not in algae, not in fungi, but otherwise it's universal. There are no intermediate gametes between sperms and eggs. Your gametes are either microgametes or they're macrogametes. You can be hermaphrodite and have both, which simply means you have both male gonads and female gonads, and sometimes at the same time, sometimes at different times of your life. And that's reasonably common in fish and other creatures, and earthworms and snails. But the divide in gamete size between microgametes and macrogametes is universal, and it comes about for a very good reason. Mathematical models have shown that isogamy, which is equal gamete size, is unstable under expected conditions, and you get a runaway natural selection effect towards some gametes becoming smaller and smaller and more numerous, other gametes becoming larger and larger and less numerous, and the small gametes becoming motile and adapted to seek out the large ones. So that's the sperm-egg divide. It is universal, and it is totally understood and is widespread and runs right through evolution.
And I mean, and just to make it clear, and you call this you don't call it, it's called anisogamy, which is a new word for me. But the point is that female gametes are large and male gametes are small, and that defines female and male.
That defines it, and there are no intermediates.
And there are no intermediates. And
sex is a binary. Sex is absolutely binary.
It's absolutely binary. And you point out, as you just said, there are mathematical models of why that happened, and it's basically economics. Do you want to go through any of those arguments? Part of Parker and others.
I could. Isogamy is a system that you get in some algae, where the gametes are of equal size, and so the costs of making a zygote, making a new individual, are borne equally by both parents. So there's an economic fairness about that they both contribute an equal amount. The unstable runaway towards anisogamy leads to one sex being the economic provider, namely the female sex, the egg sex, the ovum sex. The other sex just contributes DNA. And from that, a whole lot of things follow, a whole lot of differences between males and females throughout the animal kingdom. And it all hangs together as a coherent story of differences between the sexes, fundamentally stemming from this basic economic imbalance.
Yes. I mean, if you have larger ones, then they're more likely to survive. Smaller ones, you can do things, but then there's this economics. If you have larger ones, you have to spend more time, energy devoted to them. And you say, what's really important, and I'm really happy you described this. Definitions in science are just definitions, but what matters is if they explain things. That's what really matters, the explanatory aspect of science. And Feynman used to say, I know you like birds, but Feynman used to say it didn't matter what a bird's name was. It was it was what it does, and what and you point, and this is really important. You say the fundamental economic inequality of anisogamy illustrates a large number of biological phenomena, therefore justifying your claim that the UBD, universal biological definition of sex, does a lot of explanatory work. If you define females as macrogamete producers and males as microgamete producers, you can immediately account for the following facts, and there are 14 of them. And they go over everything. In mammals, it's the females that gestate. In bird species, when only one sex incubates, it's nearly always and one feeds the young, it's nearly always the females. In the fish that bear live young, it's nearly always the females. It goes on and on. When one sex guards the other against copulation with the others, it's nearly always the males. Polygyny is far more common than polyandry. When one sex tends to die younger than the others, it's usually the males. When one sex is larger, the other usually males. In all cases, the key is economics. Large gametes cost more than small ones. In various ways, the inequality plays out. And I think that's what's really important. Is this definition actually explains what goes on, and that's why it's important. And I think and you have a beautiful paragraph, and that maybe you can describe it, where anisogamy has dominated reproduction, but lots of other versions of sex have come and gone. And I can read it if you want, or maybe you can remember that where you.
Well, yes, I mean, excuse me, I'm going to have to clear my throat.
Okay, sure.
There are various anomalies, like in hyenas, females are very much like males. They look like males. They have bogus. They have fake male genitalia. They tend to be socially dominant, and this has given rise to legends of males giving birth. It's actually females giving birth, but they've even got fake balls. I mean, and a fake penis. There are seahorses, which are fish. The male gets pregnant. He actually has a brood pouch in his belly. And you might ask, well, how do you know it's the male? Why not define the male as the one who define the female as the one who gets pregnant? But then you would lose all the other explanatory, those 14 things that you mentioned. I don't know quite
also,
what.
I wanted to go back to that but you also pointed out that things change in time. Let me read your paragraph, because it was very liberating for me. Anisogamy has dominated reproduction, mating systems, and social systems for probably 2 billion years. All other ways to define the sexes fall afoul of numerous exceptions. Sex chromosomes come and go throughout evolutionary time. Profligate gametes spewing into the sea gives off to paired off copulation, and vice versa. Sex organs grow and shrink and grow again as the eons go by. So, I mean, a lot of these other, and you say harem systems change place with faithful monogamy, psychological concomitants of sexuality change like the wind. And so lots of other definitions change biologically with time. And what's really important. And you say that is all you need to know of sex differences, and all you need to know. One sex produced gametes and are much smaller and more numerous than the other. And you say, as Keats might have only slightly exaggerated if he'd been an evolutionary biologist. So the other definitions all are time dependent in some sense, and often species dependent. But this gamete, this description is not. And you mentioned the seahorse, but the other one you often you talk about, because a lot of enthusiasts love to talk about anemone, the clownfish,
anemone fish.
Fishes, those clownfish should love to be around.
Well, they're serial hermaphrodites. I mentioned hermaphrodites earlier. Snails and earthworms are simultaneous hermaphrodites. These fish are serial hermaphrodites, but I know they're great favorites of the sexist non-binary lobby, but they're just hermaphrodites. I mean, they're serial hermaphrodites.
And the point you point out that when it's true that when one dies, the dominant male becomes female. But what does that mean? Well, that means that dominant male, if it becomes female, suddenly starts to produce eggs instead of follows the definition of what is a female, not because it wants to be a female. It starts to produce eggs, and before that, it had produced sperm, and that therefore that defines. So it's in the case of clownfish, yes, they can change their sex, but it's still binary.
Yes, exactly.
And that's a really important point. And you actually talk about someone who I once had at one of our Origins events, and Fausto Sterling, who's argued that there's a sexual continuum, but you point out that there really isn't. It's binary. And of course there are genetic, one could say, mutants, if you want to call it that, at a very, very small level. But if you look at human population, it's not a spectrum. It's completely binary.
I have the analogy of trying to draw a bar chart, a histogram.
Yes.
The number of unambiguous male babies and unambiguous female babies, if you represent those on your histogram as the twin towers of the World Trade Center, then the intermediates, if any, the intermediates would be the height of a medium-sized molehill in between them.
And
that is not binary.
That's not binary. But then, as you point
out, that is binary. Yes.
Yeah. As you point out, even that's an overestimate. The true figure is 0, not even a molehill.
That's right.
Nobody produces middle-sized gametes, intermediate between egg and sperm. And so in that, it's clear that in that case, it really remains binary. And very importantly, and again, just to beat this dead horse one more time, there are situations where environment can determine sex, such as in snakes, right? In snakes and some lizards, where if gestation takes place at a different temperature, you'll produce either females or males, but they'll be either females or males. That's the point, right?
Yes, not intermediate.
Yeah. Okay. Now you talk about then you get in a little hairier concept, which you point out. The word gender enters the discourse trailing clouds of confusion, and it does. And of course you point out linguistically, grammatically, there are genders in different languages, and you prefer to restrict your discussion of gender to those languages rather than people, because gender and sex get confused. Absolutely.
Yes.
Let me at least point out a potential. Play the devil's advocate here a little bit, or maybe a potential different way of thinking about it. I tend to think of, you see, and I don't use women and man. I use male and female for sex, and I use woman and man for gender, because I tend to think of gender as the expression of one's sexual identity. So that if one, and so almost like genes are expressed, but it's the expression of gender identity. So a male may act like a gendered female, because in every way that's their expression of their individual's sexual identity. It doesn't make them a female, but gender-wise they're a woman. Now, I guess would you have problems with that?
Well, they're free to call themselves what they like.
Yeah.
But if they go into a boxing ring masquerading as a woman when they're actually a man, it's not their gender that knocks the other person out, it's their sex.
Yes. And it's important to realize I think the really important thing, and this is where the confusion comes from, is people conflate gender and sex, and they're not the same thing. And that's and after that it becomes a little bit more semantics. Sex as well.
Yes.
Gender has many different definitions, I guess.
I don't feel any need to use the word gender in this context. As I said, I use it in the grammatical context. If you're learning French, you have to know the gender of a noun. You have to respect the pronouns of a noun.
Yeah.
You have to respect the fact that the table is feminine.
Yeah.
But because otherwise you're not speaking proper French. That's gender. And it's a kind of accident that in some languages have 15 genders, and they perform the same role in language as what we think of as gender.
Yeah, you said you learned that from Steven Pinker. I didn't realize there were 15 languages.
Yes.
That language. That's amazing. 15 genders. And it's worth pointing out here. You say the current fashion for transsexualism belongs in a cluster of interrelated vogues, sometimes called woke, partly stemming from a sincere concern for social justice, largely well-meaning, which couldn't be said of Lysenko, but misguided and scientifically ill-informed, which could be said of Lysenko. So, I mean, I think the point is that a lot of what's happened is people, look, there are people who have, as you point out, have gender dysphoria, who or transsexuals, and one can understand and sympathize with their gender dysphoria, and one shouldn't discriminate against them as much as discriminate against anyone else. And so the social justice origin of this is one shouldn't discriminate against people who have gender dysphoria. But then that's taken to the extreme and unscientific version, which is to say that that they're not having gender dysphoria. They literally are another sex.
Exactly. And that's a perversion of language that comes from postmodernism, and that it is inadmissible in my opinion.
And the problem here you're pointing out, this wasn't a problem before. I mean, it wasn't as pervasive a problem before, is you say, well, look, people can be wished to be born the opposite sex and feel like they're trapped in the wrong body. But you say today's surrounding culture, doctors, psychiatrists, teachers, political leaders, lawyers, and perhaps above all, school friends, give more than a little push. When you say sex,
they say go for it, yes.
Yeah,
yes.
When you say sex assigned at birth is arbitrary, yes, it suggests that in fact sex is assigned and it's not real. And so it's the cultural aspect that's pushing people to make this confusion between gender and sex.
I think it would be like saying to an anorexic person who's skeletally thin, it's okay, you're not thin, you're not, it's kind of like that. It's pushing them into it.
Yeah, well, and just so both you and I can get into more troubles, there's this thing of where fat shaming, where people who are extremely obese don't. There are health problems with being extremely obese, like it or not. But the current fad is to not suggest there's a problem there. I mean, to be proud of being that, and
yes,
and and I understand it, because you don't want to. The difference is, you don't want to discriminate against people who are obese, but you don't have to say that it's healthy.
Yes, quite.
And I'm sure I'll get hate mail for that one. But anyway, and you point out that there are two other problems with this. One is simply reporting language and reporting things such as crimes that are wrong. For example, in the Bournemouth Daily Echo, she is accused of 4 counts of engaging in sexual activity in the presence of a child, and 2 counts of exposure where she, quote, intentionally exposed her penis.
Her penis, note.
Yes. Her penis. That's why. Sorry. Yes. It's intentionally exposed her penis, intending someone would see it and cause alarm or distress. And another one, a transgender woman is denied raping 2 women with her penis as she went on trial at the High Court. And that was in the Times. And you point out that has, consequences. If people report crimes by people who are actually males and call them females, and in terms of the statistics of crime reporting, and which have influence on public policy, that you get the wrong public policy if you use the wrong science.
That was a point that hadn't really occurred to me until I met it a few months ago. And it's a very important point, because the vast majority of crimes of violence are in fact committed by males. And if a male masquerading as a female if his crime is recorded as a female crime, that has a dramatic effect upon the statistics, which is quite unjust towards real women.
Yeah, you point out, I think they do the statistics, it gives a 15 times wrong estimate. But there's another problem. When one starts to do this, there's the question of thought police, which is we're seeing a lot of in the United Kingdom in particular, but also in Canada. And you say, you point out, if a journalist had said with his penis instead of her penis, the Times could have been in trouble with the police for misgendering. And this example, in 2020, the Humberside police descended on the workplace of Harry Miller to warn them that one of his tweets was being recorded as a hate incident. And what was the tweet? I was assigned mammal at birth, but my orientation is fish. Don't misspecies me.
Yes, it's a good joke.
It's a joke, and it's really a scary joke when they repeat when that gets called hate speech.
Yes,
and it's also a scary point when you just begin to ask the question about this. And I think I skipped over it here, but and you gently skip over it. In asking this question. Oh no, actually, it's later on. It's in fact, it's coming up, which is which is sex and race. You make a really interesting point, which I hadn't occurred to me, which is that race is polygenetic, right? It's polygenically inherited, and namely that when a white person and a black parent mate and produce children, the color of those children's skin can be lighter or darker, and therefore defy this notion of white and black.
Yes.
So race really is a spectrum in a sense, or can be a
Yes, it
broader.
really is. It really is a
You say,
spectrum.
and it's a question that never occurred to me. You say, why did the craze for non-biological self-identification it's sex and not race? Why the double standard? And I don't know if anyone has an answer to that.
Well, Rebecca Tuvel wrote an article about this in a philosophical journal, and she got terribly attacked for it, regarded as insane and prejudiced and transphobic and everything. She simply pointed out the truth, which is that race is a continuum. So why not encourage people who want to identify as a different race? If you're going to do that with sex, why not with race?
It's a really interesting point. Her case, by the way, just to clear this up for people, and it's in the article. In her article, she compared the case of Rachel Dolezal, who identified as a member of a different race, with Caitlyn Jenner, who's the famous American athlete who was formerly Bruce Jenner, who identified as a member of different sex. The response to her article was again Lysenko, and this is what I wanted to stress. It's hysterical. A majority of the journal's associate editors issued an apology, and the editor resigned. And of course, she was accused of being crazy, racist, transphobic, everything, even though there's everything, racist, transphobic, and stupid. And there's someone else who was attacked, and namely it was you. Based on that, you produced the following tweet. And I remember it vividly. In 2021, you produced the tweet. In 2015, Rachel Dolezal, a white chapter president of NAACP, was vilified for identifying as black. Some men choose to identify as women, and some women choose to identify as men. You will be vilified if you deny that they literally are what they identify as. Discuss, which is just like the perfect kind of question you might expect on an exam by a teacher who wants people to think. And you are, after all, a teacher and a professor. For that tweet in which you ask people to discuss, you point out you were vilified, and I think we have to point out that an organization that should know better, the American Humanist Association, retroactively took away your Humanist of the Year award for asking people to think, which is the opposite of what humanism should be all about. It's really remarkable that it's that extreme. The next thing you talk about, which is intriguing to me, because again, I'd never thought in these terms, and of course you're well known, probably the world's most famous atheist, and I have been associated with you in that regard as well, is the theology oak. You point out that there are two characteristics of the modern sort of obsession with victimization and also with the ability to change sex. And one comes from original sin and the other with transubstantiation. So why don't I open it to you to just explain that?
Well, original sin is one of Christianity's most unpleasant doctrines. It states that all people are born with sin, born with original sin. They have inherited the sin of Adam, believe it or not. And the sin of Adam comes down in the form of the semen, which is why, and Jesus was not conceived with semen, so he was free of original sin. And his mother Mary also, for theological reasons, had to be free of sin, so it was necessary that she should be immaculately conceived. So that was invented by some pope, I forget when. And original sin is fundamental, key to Christianity. And original sin has been grafted onto white people because such hideous things were done by our white ancestors to black people in the form of slavery. It really was hideous. I mean, quite utterly appalling to see. In the original version of my article, with the pictures were cut out of the published version, but I had a picture of a slave ship in which there were slaves like sardines in the ship's hold. I mean, just disgusting, just horrible, horrible, horrible cruelty. So those white people who did that deserve to be condemned in every possible way. But we who are white are not responsible for what our white ancestor did just because we are white. We can, as humans, say that humanity is capable of horrible things, but we're not we don't deserve to inherit the guilt of our ancestors simply because we're white. That is a very, very Christian kind of doctrine. It is original sin.
Nor should as you point out, that there not only are those who are to blame for such cruelty dead and unavailable, so are the African chiefs who sold Africans in slavery and the Arab slavery.
Indeed, yes.
I mean, one could argue that everyone suffers this atavistic guilt, but it's a really interesting point, and it's very, very similar to original sin. And I first heard it from Hitchens. But I understand now the quote goes much further back, that we're born ill but commanded to be well. One of the big problems of Christianity. The other one, though, is transubstantiation, which is really amazing. It is true. I mean, again, I learned it, I think, from you, that the Protestants see it as analogy, but the Roman Catholics see it as literal, right?
Yes, they use the Aristotelian distinction between substance and true essence. And so Aristotle, of course, long predates Christianity, but Aristotle was enormously influential on Christianity throughout its history.
Yes.
And so when Roman Catholics say that the blessing by a priest of the bread and wine turns it into body and blood of Christ, they obviously don't really think that it is body and blood, but except in the Aristotelian sense. That the true substance is the technical term. The true substance is body and blood, and when the priest blesses it, it's transubstantiated into so that the actual bread and wine becomes the mere Aristotelian accidental, as is the technical Aristotelian technical term. So that's what the transsexual people are effectively saying, that the very act of standing up and announcing "I am a woman" turns you into a woman. So even if you still have a penis, that's merely an Aristotelian accidental. In true substance, you are a woman. The other thing one could add is that you're being a dualist, because if you're saying that you are trapped, as they do, trapped in the wrong body, you are maybe biological male, but you're a female trapped in the wrong body. That's a kind of dualism. It's like, say, you have an immortal soul, which is a truly female soul, which is struggling to get out of this entrapment of a male body.
And the soul is the Aristotelian substance, and the male body is the Aristotelian accident.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, it's an interesting. I hadn't thought of those potential origins or support for a lot of what we're seeing in the case of both this victimhood mentality and power and oppression and sex versus gender. You conclude an interesting statement that I'm not sure. I want to read the statement. I'm not sure I agree with it 100%. You say, if your science is so weak that the best you can do is yell that your opponent is a Mendelist, Morganist, or a Wisemanist, a transphobic bigot, a TERF, or a full-on MAGA alt-right Trump supporter, you've already lost the argument. Well, of course, you've lost the logical argument. What worries me is, in the modern world, you don't lose the argument.
Well, that's true enough. Yes.
And that I think is the real problem here. And one of the reasons we wrote, one of the reasons we've written this book is that we, at least in academia and in science, and we should be the logical argument should take precedence, and not the noise. And you point out that a large part of this is in this weird notion that language somehow is violent. That violence can be done by language.
Oh God, yes, yeah.
As opposed to physical violence. And I want to give you the last word by reading your last words. There's an addendum that I won't read, but the last words: a position should be supported or refuted by rational discussion informed by evidence. People who terminate an argument by resorting to threats or name calling are ignominiously signaling that they've lost the argument. Like Lysenko, it took decades and the death of Stalin for Russia to see through Lysenko. Let us hope we, in our century, don't take quite so long to come to our senses. And that's a great hope, and that's one of the reasons we wrote this book, and one of the reasons you kindly wrote this beautiful article that begins the book. And we hope that the book will being written by people from inside rather than outside, who are criticizing what's going on, and from a diverse group of scientific disciplines and scholarly disciplines and political ideologies, all arguing that basically a person should be supported or refuted by rational discussion informed by evidence, which is really the heart of science and the heart of academia. And you always describe it beautifully. Thank you for describing it in the book, and thank you for being here to elaborate on it in this discussion. Thanks again, Richard.
Thank you very much.